This video is about demand. Now, demand in economics refers to a quantity of a good or a service that consumers are both willing and able to buy. Right? So it's a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at a given price, or at various prices. Right? So always remember that they need to be both willing and able. If they are able to buy but they are not willing, then it's not demand. And if they are willing but they're not able to buy it, that's also not demand, right? Now, the amount at a particular price level, the demand for a product is called the quantity demanded. Okay, denoted by QD, the quantity demanded. Now, we have something called the law of demand. Now, the law of demand says that demand shares an inverse relationship, right? So it's inversely proportional to price. What this means is, as the price increases, the demand for that product will decrease. Likewise, if the price decreases, the demand will increase. So, but this does not mean that if demand increases, price will necessarily decrease. Demand could increase for other reasons, right? So it works one way but not the other. Now, other than price, right? So these are things that can increase demand, things other than price today. So these are called determinants of demand. So you have things like fashion and tastes. Uh, you also have advertising. So you can break it down into habits, tastes, and advertising. Then you have regulations, such as government policies. Government increase the tax on a certain good, and that makes it really expensive. You might not want to buy that. Or if the economy is in a bad shape, if you're in a recession, the probably demand for luxury goods is going to fall. And then another thing is also income. Income, obviously, if you don't have a high income, you don't really, you would like luxury goods, but you're not going to spend all your money on luxury goods because you have other things that you need to attend to, and you don't want to use up all your income. You're going to want a safety net. So, yeah. And then the last thing is substitutes and complements. Now, substitutes and complements basically uh, refer to alternate products. So, or rather, substitutes refer to alternate products. So, like you have Coca-Cola and then you have Pepsi, right? That's also demanded. Um, Now, complements are things that are jointly demanded. So, things like popcorn at movie theaters. So, when you buy a ticket for a movie, you most likely going to buy popcorn too. Um, if you're buying, a football boot, you're probably going to want a jersey as well, and maybe even a ball. If you're buying a tennis racket, you'll probably want a ball as well. If you're buying, um, a new car or a new house, you'll probably want to get insurance, right? So things like these. So these are things that determine, that affect demand. So, if Habits and tastes are basically if you're more inclined towards something, the demand for that product is going to be higher. And advertising, if you have, persuasive ads, it's going to persuade you to buy products. Like during, maybe you've seen an advert for um, a Cadbury Dairy Milk bar, and then after that you want to buy that. So that's persuasive advertising, and that's increasing the demand for your product. Now, government policies, like I said, anything that it could be used also to promote products as well as discourage consumption. If the economy is growing and it's fantastic, the boom in the economy, probably going to want to spend more, invest in the economy and all that. Income, high income spend more, low income probably spend less, right? I mean, not necessarily, but usually that's what happens. Substitutes. So how substitutes affect demand is if the price of Coca-Cola decreases, Pepsi is gonna want to decrease their prices. Um, because if Coca-Cola is from $1, they move down to 0.90 cents, right? But Pepsi is still at $1. They basically taste the same, right? To most people, they taste the same. So more people are going to want to go and buy Coke because it's cheaper, right? You're not going to want to spend that extra 10 cents. It might not seem like much, but if you're buying, let's say, 100 bottles of Coke, that's $100, or 100 bottles of Pepsi. That's $100 for Pepsi, with just 90 for Coca-Cola. You're saving $10 there. So what this means is if the price does not change, right? So if the demand or if the price of Coca-Cola decreases, then the demand for Pepsi will decrease unless there's a change in the price. Now, complements is it's gonna be an inverse relationship. So if the demand for a movie or if the price for a movie increases, then the demand for popcorn will fall because you're spending more on the movie. You're now probably gonna say, okay, popcorn's a little too expensive now, right? Uh, Likewise, you're buying a football, you're buying boots, but then the price of boots increase. Then you're gonna say maybe you don't want the jersey because it's too much. The demand for the jersey falls. So that's how substitutes and complements affect demand. So this is how a typical demand curve looks. So you'll see that it has a negative gradient because remember the law of demand, that's price and quantity demanded share an inverse relationship, right? So it's going to have a negative gradient. Now here what we have is we have this point, we have 3 points marked on this graph. The first point is in the middle, and that's the original price. This was the quantity demanded at that price. Now, as the price increases from P1 to P2, right, this way, the quantity demanded falls from Q1 to Q2. And as the price decreases from P1 to P3, as you can see, the demand for the product increases from Q1 to Q3. So a decrease in demand or a movement to the left is called a contraction. Okay, a contraction in demand. And from Q1 to Q3, a movement to the right, an increase in demand is called an extension. Right. So remember that any movement along this line is only caused by a change in price, right? A change in demand won't necessarily lead to a change in price. So now you remember the determinants, right? So if that causes a change, how would that be represented in the graph? Well, usually it results in a movement of the line itself. So something like this or like this. So if it moves to the right like this, that's an increase in demand, not an increase in quantity demanded, but an increase in demand itself. Right? An increase in quantity demanded would be an extension, the movement along the line. An increase in demand would be a movement off the line to the right. So now at the same price, right, at the same price here, I can continue that line, you'll see that now the quantity demanded is much higher for the same price. Maybe because of persuasive advertising, whatever, right? And that's how, companies, they increase demand, you know, by not changing the price. And this is how they combat inflation and all of that. Now, movement to the left is a decrease in demand, and this is caused by, bad advertising, some bad reputation, government policies, whatever, right? So for the same price level, again, okay, for this same price level, you have a huge drop in the quantity demanded, right? See, this is the original, this is the increase, and this was the decrease. So big drop in the quantity demanded and a big increase in the quantity demanded at the same price. So this is how demand works. So now we're going to look at price elasticity of demand. So price elasticity of demand essentially measures the degree of responsiveness of the quantity demanded of a product following a change in its price. So that basically means all that it's measuring is how much the demand changes following a change in price. Price elasticity of demand is calculated using the formula percentage change in quantity demanded. This is percentage, right? This delta represents change, and QD is quantity. So it's percentage change in quantity demanded divided by your percentage change in price. So based on the number that we get out of this equation, we can determine whether a product is price elastic or price inelastic. These are the only two actual, practical in your day-to-day life cases that happen. Although there are three more hypothetical cases that can happen. So we'll go over all of them now. First, we'll start with our real world cases. Price elastic basically means that demand changes disproportionately to price. So what that means is a change in price will lead to a change in revenue. Okay. Now revenue is the total amount of money that you get coming in, and this will lead to a massive change in revenue, right? Because the demand can either increase or decrease depending on whether the price has increased or decreased, right? So basically, if you have, let's say, $1, a $1 packet of gum, and 1,000 people buy that packet of gum, right? And now this changes to $51.5 or $1.50, and now only 200 people buy that, right? For a 50% change in the price, you've only gotten 20% of your original customer database, and that's a 80% change, right? That's an 80% change for a 50% change in price. Now, price inelastic basically means that regardless of the change in price, the demand stays more or less the same. Okay, there's a very slight change in demand, but the demand is more or less the same. That's what price inelastic refers to. Now, looking at these three, before we look at these three, we look at calculating uh, price elasticity. So, a product is said to be price elastic if the number that we get out of that formula is greater than 1. And this is ignoring the minus sign. So for price elasticity of demand, because your change is always going to be negative in one way or the other, because it shares an inverse relationship, your answers are always going to be negative. So you must ignore, the negative sign. And now price inelastic demand is if it is less than 1, right? Seems quite straightforward. So when we look at perfectly price elastic, right, that basically means that a change in price, any change in price, even a hundredth of a cent, will lead to no quantity demanded. So the price elasticity, that means the value is equal to infinity, right? Your price elasticity of demand is equal to infinity. That is when you're perfectly price elastic, and there is no quantity demanded in any change in price. So price is the same, and there's an infinite demand. Basically, this would happen if a change in price would basically mean that everyone decides to buy a substitute. That's like almost impossible. Now, perfectly price inelastic basically says that any change in price will lead to no change in the demand. You have you have guaranteed demand, a guaranteed level of demand, regardless of the price. So you could have $1,000, you could charge $1,000, and your demand would not change. And this is when price elasticity is equal to 0, right? Now, unitary elasticity is when it's exactly equal to 1. So what this says is the percentage change is proportional to the change in price. So your graph would look something like this. We look at graphs later, but it basically look something like this. The area or the total revenue is always equal. Revenue is constant. So if you were charging $2 for something and you had 100 customers, and if you increase the price to $4, you'd only have 50 customers. $1 would give you 200. And so your total revenue is always going to be equal. Now, price elasticity of demand, it's affected by determinants just like demand. Substitutes affects price elasticity, then income, again, common between the two, habits, advertisement. Now, here a couple of new things here is the cost of switching. So if there's a high cost of switching, the price it's probably going to be price inelastic because it doesn't make sense. And then necessity. So if something is essential, then it's going to be price inelastic because you need it. You're going to have to pay whatever price it is to get that, right? If something is like a luxury good and it's really expensive, you're probably not going to buy it because it's not necessary. You can live without it. But something like, let's say, food, maybe a packet of rice, you're going to need it. So you will pay, if it used to be $1 last week and now it's 10, you're going to pay that price. Most likely going to pay that price if you can afford it because you need it, right? And time is another determinant. So how time affects price elasticity is basically people need time to change their habits. So in a shorter period of time, things tend to be price inelastic, but the more your time period is, the longer your time period is, the more price elastic things tend to be. Right? Then you also have durability. So if something is, extremely durable, then you're not going to buy it if prices increase. But if something is not very durable, and you know, uh, if something is not very durable and expires or breaks quickly, you're going to keep buying it if it's essential. You're going to keep buying it even as prices increase. And then also the breadth of definition of a product. So it seems quite complicated, but that basically refers to how wide your scope of view is or how wide your category is. Because the more things you have, the more price inelastic it tends to be. So if you look at the overall demand for fruits, so now apples, bananas, mangoes, oranges, grapefruits, what else? All of that, if you tend to look at the demand, that will be price inelastic. But if you look at apples individually, that will tend to be more price elastic, right? Now, price elasticity of demand is essentially used to help producers to determine their price. That's essentially it. You know, it helps them predict how much revenue they can get, and they'll use that to calculate, the revenue that they're going to get and choose the price that they want to set, right? And also, this can help governments determine their taxation policies. So, something is price inelastic. They're going to want to put really, really heavy taxes, like 500%. Okay, because a 100% tax is probably not going to affect it that as much as a 500% tax. Because if it's inelastic, the demand's going to be relatively the same. If a government wants to discourage consumption, but if something is price elastic, a 5% tax would probably do the work that a 500% tax would do for an inelastic product, right? And it also allows, people to charge different prices for different customers, right? So, if you know that some customers are not going to pay as much, you can charge them a lower amount if you know that the demand is price elastic. And if it's inelastic, you can charge them all the same amount. So you can also, workers can also use price elasticity to negotiate their wages. So how does it work is if they know that a product is price inelastic, they know that the demand for the product is going to remain more or less constant. That it's going to stay at in a tight range, and it's going to be within that range. So you know that regardless of the price, it's going to be within this range. So they can ask for higher wages because they know that the company can afford it. Because if the price increases, their revenue would also increase. So they can ask the company for higher wages, and they know that the company will need them. Even if prices decrease, the company is still going to need them. Right? So this is how price elasticity of demand is used. So now we're going to look at the graphs. So this is for price inelastic demand. So as you can see, there is a very steep gradient. That's because the quantity demanded is not going to change regardless of change in price. So if you look at a massive change in price, the quantity demanded barely changed. So you have this big of a change, but it's just this much of a change in quantity. So now, for price elastic demand, the gradient is going to be very, very gradual. So it looks something like this. So even the tiniest change in price, so that's a pretty tiny change in price. But look at the change in demand. Tiny drop led to a massive increase in the quantity demanded. So this is price elastic. Now we're going to look at the three special cases. That's perfectly price elastic, perfectly price inelastic, and unitary elasticity. So perfectly price elastic would look something like this. A change in price would lead to no quantity demanded. As you can see, there is no quantity demanded here or here. Now you might wonder why there's no, if the price drops, why there's no change in, why there's no quantity demanded, right? How this would work is basically if the price drops, they might think that the product is made from cheap materials and not buy it. Right, so this is perfectly price elastic. Now, perfectly price inelastic would look something like this. So, regardless of the change in price, your quantity demanded is always the same. Now, unitary elasticity is a little tricky to draw. It looks something like this. So, how this works is the total area that this point falls under should equal the total area that any point falls under. So this area right here, right, should equal this area right here. It'll always be equal because that's your total revenue. So remember, revenue is constant in unitary elasticity. So that's how your graphs are going to look.